March 1943, Camp Crystal Springs, New Mexico. The transport truck's engine coughed to silence under a blazing desert sun. Dust settled like fine powder over everything as the tailgate dropped with a metallic clang. 12 Japanese women stepped onto American soil, their worn uniforms clinging to exhausted frames, eyes scanning for the brutality they'd been promised to expect. Instead, they found something that would shatter every assumption they'd carried across the Pacific. Clean wooden barracks stretched before them, laundry lines hung with fresh linens, and floating on the desert air came an impossible scent. Soap. Real soap, not the harsh lye mixture they'd known, but something that smelled like flowers and cleanliness itself. These women had no idea they were about to witness something that would change their understanding of captivity forever. The desert heat pressed against everything like a living thing, but Lieutenant Margaret O'Brien moved through Camp Crystal Springs with the crisp efficiency of someone who understood that order could exist even in chaos. Her auburn hair was pinned beneath her regulation cap, and her uniform remained spotless despite the dust that seemed to coat every surface within minutes of cleaning. She had spent 3 months preparing for this moment, studying Geneva Convention protocols until the words blurred together on the page, ensuring every detail would meet international standards. America would show the world that even enemies could be treated with dignity. The women who emerged from that transport truck moved with the careful precision of people who had learned to expect the worst. Their leader, a woman in her 30s named Keiko Nakamura, had been a teacher in Osaka before the war swept her into roles she never imagined. Her dark eyes took in every detail of the camp with the sharp attention of someone cataloguing potential threats and possible escapes. Behind her came nurses, clerks, radio operators and translators, each carrying the weight of stories that would never be fully told. What struck Margaret most was their posture. Despite weeks of travel, despite the uncertainty that must have gnawed at them like hunger, they maintained an almost military bearing. Pride. These women refused to be, she realized, was universal. Broken, even in captivity, even thousands of miles from everything they'd ever known. The processing began immediately. Forms filled out in careful English, medical examinations conducted with professional courtesy, photographs taken for identification cards that would define their existence for the duration of the war. Margaret observed from a distance, noting how the women helped each other with translations, how they formed protective clusters around the youngest members of their group. Survival, she understood, was often a collective effort. But it was the moment they were assigned to their quarters that everything changed. The barracks had been constructed according to strict military specifications, but Margaret had insisted on modifications that went beyond the minimum requirements. Each woman received not just a cot, but a mattress that wasn't stuffed with straw. Not just a blanket, but two, both clean and free from the musty smell of long storage. Not just a space, but privacy screens made from canvas that created small sanctuaries within the larger room. Keiko ran her fingers along the wooden frame of her assigned cot, testing its stability. In the detention centres back home, before their transport to America, they had slept on mats laid directly on concrete floors. The luxury of an actual bed seemed almost absurd. She pressed her palm against the mattress, feeling the give of real stuffing. Not the lumpy, uneven padding they'd grown accustomed to. But the real shock came when they discovered the washhouse. Margaret had fought bureaucratic battles for weeks to ensure this facility met her standards. The building contained rows of actual sinks with running water, hot and cold taps that functioned reliably, and mirrors that weren't cracked or clouded with age. Along the walls stood shower stalls, each with its own curtain for privacy, fed by a water system that had been tested and retested to ensure consistent pressure and temperature. The Japanese women entered this space in stunned silence. Sachiko Tanaka, the youngest at 19, turned a faucet handle with trembling fingers and watched clean, clear water flow in a steady stream. She cupped her hands beneath it, feeling the warmth against her palms, and for a moment forgot where she was. In the camps where they'd been held before transport, water had been rationed, often discoloured, sometimes carrying the metallic taste of old pipes or contamination. Beside each sink sat items that transformed confusion into amazement. bars of genuine soap. Not the harsh industrial blocks they'd known, but real toilet soap that created actual lather. Small towels, rough but clean, that smelled of sunshine and proper laundering. Toothbrushes with firm bristles and tubes of tooth-something beyond powder that promised mere survival. Keiko picked up one of the soap bars, turning it over in her hands like an archaeologist, examining an artifact from a lost civilization. The scent that rose from it was floral, gentle, completely unlike anything she'd encountered in months of captivity. She looked around at her companions, seeing her own bewilderment reflected in their faces. This had to be some form of psychological warfare, she reasoned. Make them comfortable, make them dependent on luxuries, then strip it all away when it served some strategic purpose. The Americans were known for their industrial capacity, their abundance of resources. Perhaps this was simply another weapon in their arsenal, designed to weaken resolve through unexpected kindness. But as the days passed, the pattern held. No one came to remove the soap or declare the hot water a temporary privilege. No guards appeared to mock their use of the facilities or time their bathing with cruel precision. The washhouse remained available, consistently stocked, maintained with the same attention to detail as any other part of the camp infrastructure. The transformation began subtly. Women who had learned to move through their days with the grey efficiency of survival started taking longer at the mirrors. Hair that had been simply pulled back for practicality began to show signs of careful arrangement. Faces that had grown hard with the necessities of endurance softened slightly as the constant tension of expecting the worst began to ease. Margaret watched this evolution from her office window, understanding that she was witnessing something profound. These women weren't just cleaning themselves, they were reclaiming pieces of their humanity that captivity had threatened to erode. The simple act of washing with real soap, of looking into a clear mirror, of having privacy behind a shower curtain, was allowing them to remember who they had been before the war reduced them to numbers and categories. The ripple effects spread through other aspects of camp life. Women who had barely spoken began engaging in quiet conversations during their evening routines. Laughter, tentative at first, began to emerge from the washhouse in the mornings. Small gestures of care appeared as they helped each other with tasks that had become communal rituals rather than solitary necessities. Keiko found herself struggling with emotions she hadn't expected to feel. Gratitude was dangerous in captivity, she'd been taught. It made you vulnerable, made you forget that your captors were still your enemies. But how could she maintain that hostility when faced with consideration that exceeded anything she'd experienced in her own country's facilities? How could she hold on to hatred when the evidence before her suggested that her captors saw her as something more than a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved? The moral complexity of the situation settled over the camp like the desert dust that coated everything, persistent and impossible to completely sweep away. The evening ritual became a sanctuary none of them had anticipated. As the desert sun painted the New Mexico sky in shades of amber and crimson, the women gathered in the washhouse with a regularity that spoke to something deeper than mere hygiene. Keiko observed her companions with the careful attention of someone trying to decode a puzzle that grew more complex each day. Yuki Sato, a former nurse from Kyoto, had developed an elaborate routine that transformed the simple act of washing into something approaching ceremony. She would arrange her soap, towel and small personal items with precise spacing along the sink's edge, then methodically work through each step as if following a medical protocol. But there was tenderness in her movements now, a gentleness that hadn't existed during their first desperate weeks of captivity. The water itself had become a source of wonder that bordered on disbelief. Sachiko would sometimes stand beneath the shower stream longer than necessary, letting the warmth cascade over shoulders that had grown accustomed to the permanent tension of survival. The pressure remained constant, the temperature reliable, defying every expectation they'd carried about American prison camps. In the detention centres back home, bathing had been a hurried, communal affair conducted under the watchful eyes of guards who treated basic human needs as inconveniences to be managed with maximum efficiency. But here, privacy curtains created individual spaces where vulnerability could exist without shame. Women who had learned to change clothes with the rapid modesty of those always watched could now take time with their appearance, could tend to small vanities that connected them to the people they'd been before. Uniforms and identification numbers defined their existence. Margaret noticed the changes during her daily inspections. The women moved differently now, carried themselves with something that resembled their original dignity rather than the brittle pride of the desperate. Their uniforms, while still the same regulation garments, appeared more carefully maintained. Hair that had been simply functional showed signs of attention, of styling that served no purpose beyond the basic human desire to present oneself well. The soap supply became a point of particular fascination for the camp's American personnel. Sergeant Patricia Williams, who managed the facility's logistics, found herself fielding unusual requests from the supply depot. The consumption rate exceeded all projections, not because the women were wasteful, but because they used the soap for purposes beyond basic washing. Some had begun laundering their personal items by hand with a thoroughness that suggested deep appreciation for the luxury of cleanliness. Williams discovered that several women had become experts at making their soap bars last longer, creating thin slivers that they combined with careful precision to form new bars. It was an art form born of scarcity, practiced even in the face of abundance. Old habits, she realized, died hard when they'd been forged by genuine need. The psychological impact rippled through interactions that had nothing to do with hygiene. During mealtimes, conversations flowed more freely among women who no longer carried the defensive tension of people expecting cruelty at any moment. The communal tables in the mess hall, once occupied by silent figures focused solely on sustenance, began to host discussions conducted in the mixture of broken English and rapid Japanese that became the camp's unofficial language. Dr. Helen Morrison, the camp's medical officer, documented changes that went beyond the obvious improvements in personal cleanliness. Stress-related ailments that had plagued the women during their first weeks showed marked improvement. Sleep patterns normalized as the constant hypervigilance of expecting abuse began to fade. Even minor injuries healed more quickly in bodies that were no longer operating under the sustained pressure of survival mode. But the transformation created its own complications. Keiko found herself caught between gratitude and suspicion, between the evidence of her senses and the warnings that had been drilled into her consciousness. Enemy nations didn't provide luxuries to prisoners unless those luxuries served strategic purposes. The kindness had to be calculated, designed to extract information or cooperation through psychological manipulation rather than physical coercion. She began conducting her own informal investigations, watching the American personnel for signs of the trap she remained convinced must exist. But the guards maintained professional distance without cruelty. The medical staff treated ailments with competent care that showed no favoritism based on nationality. The administrative personnel processed requests and complaints with bureaucratic efficiency that seemed genuinely aimed at following regulations rather than finding excuses to deny reasonable needs. The evidence accumulated daily, creating cognitive dissonance that proved more unsettling than outright hostility might have been. Enemies were supposed to act like enemies. Captors were supposed to demonstrate their power through deprivation and humiliation. The alternative suggested possibilities that challenged everything she'd been taught about the nature of warfare, about the character of Americans, about the fundamental assumptions that had shaped her understanding of this conflict. Late one evening, as she prepared for sleep in a bed that remained impossibly comfortable, Keiko allowed herself to consider a dangerous thought. What if this treatment represented not strategy, but principle? What if the Americans genuinely believed that even enemies deserved basic human dignity? The implications of that possibility terrified her more than any physical threat could have, because it suggested that everything she'd been told about this war, about these people, about the righteousness of her own nation's cause, might require fundamental re-evaluation. The washhouse mirrors reflected more than clean faces now. They reflected women beginning to question certainties that had once seemed unshakable, confronting the uncomfortable possibility that understanding their enemies might be more complex than anyone had prepared them to handle. The breakfast bell rang at 0600 hours, its familiar clang echoing across the compound like a metallic rooster call. But what followed defied every expectation the women had carried about prison food, about punishment disguised as sustenance. The mess hall doors opened to reveal long wooden tables set with actual place settings, metal trays that gleamed under fluorescent lights, and steam rising from serving stations that smelled of real cooking rather than institutional boiling. Keiko approached the serving line with the cautious steps of someone who had learned that hope could be weaponized against the hopeful. Behind the counter stood Private James Murphy, a red-haired farm boy from Iowa whose gentle manner seemed at odds with the rifle that hung from his shoulder. He smiled as she approached, not the predatory grin of someone enjoying power over the powerless, but something that appeared genuinely welcoming. The first tray she received contained scrambled eggs that were actually yellow, not the grey paste she'd grown accustomed to in detention centres. Beside them sat strips of bacon that crackled with residual heat, toast that had been buttered while still warm, and a small cup of what appeared to be genuine orange juice. The portions weren't calculated to the minimum caloric requirements for survival. They were generous, abundant, served with the same casual efficiency she imagined American soldiers received in their own mess halls. Yuki accepted her tray with hands that trembled slightly, not from weakness now, but from disbelief. The bacon alone represented more meat than she'd seen in weeks of captivity. The eggs were prepared with butter, a luxury that had disappeared from Japanese civilian life long before any of them had been captured. The toast came from bread that was white, soft, made from flour that hadn't been stretched with sawdust or rice hulls. But it was the small details that proved most unsettling. Salt and pepper shakers sat on every table, available for unrestricted use. Napkins, actual paper napkins, were stacked beside the serving stations. Coffee flowed from large urns, black and strong and served without rationing or time limits. The abundance felt almost obscene when measured against the shortages that had defined their recent existence. Sachiko bit into her toast and felt her eyes well with tears she couldn't explain or control. The flavour was simple, basic, exactly what bread was supposed to taste like when it wasn't adulterated with substitutes or preserved beyond its natural lifespan. She chewed slowly, savouring not just the taste but the implications of what it represented. Wheat flour used for prisoners of war when their own captured civilians were making do with inferior substitutes. The conversations that began to emerge during these meals carried undertones of bewilderment that no one dared voice directly. How could they maintain hatred for people who fed them better than their own government had managed in the final months before capture? How could they preserve the righteous anger that was supposed to sustain them through imprisonment when their captors seemed determined to undermine that anger with kindness that felt increasingly genuine? Margaret observed these breakfast scenes from the administrative office that overlooked the mess hall, understanding that she was witnessing something unprecedented in her military experience. Prisoner management typically focused on containment and compliance, on maintaining order through clear hierarchies of power that left no doubt about who controlled resources and privileges. But the women at those tables weren't behaving like traditional prisoners. They were beginning to relax, to engage with each other, and even with their guards in ways that suggested the fundamental dynamic of the camp was shifting. Sergeant Williams approached Margaret's desk with the weekly supply reports, her expression troubled. "Ma'am, we're seeing consumption patterns that don't match any of the projections from headquarters. These women are eating every portion we serve them, but they're also gaining weight at rates that suggest they were significantly malnourished when they arrived." Margaret looked up from the paperwork that never seemed to diminish, focusing on the implications of what Williams was reporting. Malnourished, how severely? Dr. Morrison says some of them were probably weeks away from serious health complications if their nutritional status hadn't improved. The youngest one, Sachiko, has gained 12 pounds since arrival, and she's still underweight by any reasonable medical standard. The reality behind those numbers settled into Margaret's consciousness, like cold water. These women hadn't just been prisoners in American hands. They'd been deteriorating long before capture, victims of a supply system that was failing to maintain basic human needs even for its own personnel. The abundant meals at Camp Crystal Springs weren't just generous by prison standards. They represented nutritional intervention that was literally saving lives. That evening, as the women gathered for their customary washhouse routines, Keiko found herself studying her reflection with attention that went beyond vanity, or even basic grooming. Her face had filled out slightly, losing the hollow-cheeked appearance that had made her look older than her years. Her hair, now that it was consistently clean and properly nourished from within, had regained some of the luster she remembered from her teaching days in Osaka. But the changes went deeper than physical restoration. The constant tension that had lived between her shoulder blades for months was beginning to ease. Sleep came more naturally now, unmarked by the hypervigilance that had kept her alert to dangers that never materialized. Her body was remembering what it felt like to exist without the constant stress of survival mode, and that remembrance was more disorienting than any physical discomfort had been. Yuki approached the mirror beside her, beginning her evening routine with movements that had become increasingly ritualized. "Do you think they're fattening us for something?" she asked quietly in Japanese, voicing the concern that lurked beneath all their tentative comfort. Keiko considered the question seriously, as she had every night since their arrival. "I've been watching for patterns, for signs that this is temporary or conditional, but everything suggests they intend to maintain these standards indefinitely." "That makes no sense from a strategic perspective," Yuki replied, working soap into a lather between her palms. "Resources are finite, even in America. Feeding prisoners better than necessary diverts supplies from their own war effort." "Unless," Sachiko interjected from the neighbouring sink, her voice barely audible above the sound of running water, "they actually believe what they say about treating prisoners according to international law." The suggestion hung in the humid air of the washhouse like a challenge to everything they'd been taught about American character and intentions. Geneva Convention compliance wasn't supposed to be genuine moral commitment. It was supposed to be propaganda, a facade maintained for international observers while real brutality occurred behind closed doors. But the doors here weren't closed. Red Cross inspectors arrived monthly, conducting interviews in private, examining facilities with the thoroughness of people genuinely investigating compliance, rather than simply confirming predetermined conclusions. The women had been coached by Keiko to expect these inspections to be theatrical performances, with conditions temporarily improved for show before returning to harsh reality. Instead, the inspections revealed that the standards they experienced daily were exactly what the Americans reported to international authorities. No temporary upgrades, no hidden punishments restored after the observers departed. The soap remained abundant, the food remained generous, the medical care remained attentive and professional. Dr. Morrison had begun conducting what she called wellness evaluations, medical examinations that went beyond the minimum required to detect communicable diseases or security risks. She checked for vitamin deficiencies, monitored weight gain to ensure it remained healthy rather than excessive, and treated minor ailments with the same attention she would have given American personnel. During one such examination, she explained her approach to Keiko in careful, simple English, supplemented with gestures and drawings. "Strong bodies, healthy minds. Good for everyone, you understand?" Keiko understood more than Dr. Morrison realised. The medical officer wasn't just following protocols. She was applying professional standards that treated the women as patients rather than prisoners, as human beings whose health mattered beyond its utility to military objectives. The moral complexity of their situation deepened with each passing day, each meal, each hot shower, each night of uninterrupted sleep on a comfortable mattress. Hatred required justification, and that justification was being systematically undermined by evidence that their captors possessed qualities that didn't align with the propaganda that had shaped their expectations. Late at night, lying in the darkness of the barracks, Keiko listened to the quiet breathing of her companions and wrestled with questions that had no comfortable answers. If Americans were capable of this level of decency toward their enemies, what did that say about the information they'd been given about American intentions and character? If these individuals could treat prisoners with dignity and care, what did that suggest about the broader conflict that had brought them all to this desert camp? The transformation wasn't just physical restoration from malnutrition and stress. It was the slow, uncomfortable process of having fundamental assumptions challenged by daily experience that refused to conform to expectations. And that process, Keiko was beginning to understand, might prove more difficult to navigate than any amount of physical hardship could have been. These women had entered American captivity expecting cruelty and found humanity instead. In washhouses that smelled of real soap, at breakfast tables laden with generous portions, through medical care that treated them as patients rather than problems, they discovered that their enemies possessed a capacity for decency that shattered every assumption they'd carried across an ocean of war. Sometimes the most profound revelations come not from dramatic moments, but from the quiet accumulation of kindness where brutality was expected. Hit that subscribe button if you want more untold stories that reveal the complex humanity hidden within history's darkest chapters.